Hey guys, welcome back to the Psalms to God YouTube channel. I'm Ree, and this is the Breakfast and Bible series. We're talking about what it means to be a woman of God. And that conversation is not complete without a conversation on modesty, right? If you grew up in the church, you've heard a lot about modesty. And I'm here to tell you that most of it I probably disagree with. So buckle up. This is probably going to be a wild ride. I'm going to try to keep it concise, but this episode will probably be longer than most because it's a lot. There are a lot of things to talk about when it comes to modesty. There are a lot of feelings and traumas that people have experienced concerning modesty. And I'm going to expound on a lot of this stuff in a blog post. You can find it below. Number one, I find it easier to communicate thoughts more clearly in writing, mainly because I can go back and read it, and even though I could script out something to write before I record an episode, it just feels so unnatural to try to read it and record what I'm saying you guys would hate that video. So I typically record myself talking, and I may edit a couple things here and there, but for the most part, I'm just going straight at it. And so it's a lot easier to get into the details in a text format. And also, there are a lot of verses that we want to talk about. Anytime you're doing in-depth Bible studies, anytime you're really getting into the word, you should be reading the verses on your own. And when I write things on the blog, you can hover over the Bible verse and see it come up, or I can write out the verse in the text. Whereas here, if we read through every single verse, that's a problem. I'm sorry if you guys can hear that sound. That would be the trash people picking up the trash outside. That is the hazard of living in civilization. It gets noisy sometime. So I'm going to pause for a second. Might have to cut this part out because they're loud. Loud and squeaky. They need new brakes. Okay. Anyway, so back to modesty. So we don't have time to go into every single nook and cranny, every single verse. I just want to hit on some very key points that I think are important when you study modesty. One of my big things that I hope you've noticed on the channel and on my blog is that I don't believe that it's my responsibility or calling or job or any of the above to tell you what is right and what is wrong, what to believe, what not to believe. I think my job is to help you study, to help you get closer to the Most High and to the Holy Spirit. And it's the Holy Spirit's job to tell you what's right and wrong through your own study and relationship with the Holy Spirit. So that is the information that I try to give, particularly on topics where people have such strong opinions and there is controversy. I'm not really trying to come on here and be like, this is right, this is wrong, you should wear this, you shouldn't wear that, etc., etc. I think that everybody choose you this day whom you will follow and whom you will serve. Let every woman work out their salvation with fear and trembling, right? I think it is up to each of us. And I just want to give you things to think about as you're studying that topic. So remember that as we go into this video, it's not going to be super in depth where we hit every single verse because we just don't have time for that. But you will see a lot of stuff where I was taking notes and I've written some things down. And some of that we'll cover and some of that we will probably just mention and kind of skip over in the interest of time, of course. So one of the interesting things about the word modesty, or modest as it appears in the King James Version, is it only appears in one verse. That is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. And it may mean modest. It may mean appropriate. There's slightly different connotations there, but that's really the only place that is explicitly called out. Now, there are other verses that maybe talk about the concept of modesty. I looked up different verses and, Bible studies on modesty and pulled out the verses that people reference the most. And I found quite a bit of verses. I only listed some of them here. But one of the things that I found interesting about these verses is that almost none of them have anything to do with what you wear. And even the ones that do have something to do with what you wear, it's not telling you what to wear. It's not like, yeah, tight clothing is immodest. Don't wear tight clothing. It doesn't say that. It says things like in 1 Timothy chapter 2, where it says your attire should be modest, which is a very vague statement if you think about it. A lot of people have defined modesty for themselves, which is a combination of the dictionary definition and society's definition. It is not hardcore. If it was, everybody would agree. Like, for instance, I am wearing a white hoodie. It is white. Everybody agrees that this is white. Now, you may have some colorblind people who might not think it's white or something like that. But for the most part, we can all agree that this is white and that this wall behind me is like an aqua, blue, teal range of a color, right? That's very much a measurable and concrete thing. But when we start talking about modesty, like what is modest, right? Are knee-length shorts modest? Is that okay? Most of us here in the United States would say, yeah, that's fine. That's definitely modest. I don't think they would agree with you if you went to Saudi Arabia. I'm just saying, right? The definition changes depending on who you're talking about. But then we have this conundrum that God doesn't change. It tells us that in Malachi, God doesn't change. So if it's immodest here, shouldn't it be immodest over here too? Right? Like, this is the problem when you start getting into the conversation around modesty and attire. But like I said, most of the verses that I found that people reference when talking about modesty actually talk about humbleness and having a modest demeanor. And I think that even when I read 1 Timothy chapter 2, I feel like that is the heart of the matter, is that as a woman or a man, but we're here to talk about us as women, so I'll let the men talk about the men if they ever get around to it. But as a woman, I don't want people's main impression of me to be my physical aesthetic. I mean, sure, I don't want people to walk away and be like, boy, she was ugly, right? Like, I don't want people to just think I'm like a hideous person. I don't think anybody wants to be viewed as ugly. And I don't think God wants us to view ourselves as ugly. I think we're supposed to have some level of self-respect and self-esteem because we are fearfully and wonderfully made, right? But what I want people to remember about me is my personality. And I want these personality attributes to be godly attributes. I want them to remember my works. That's what it says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10. But in particular, if I interact with someone, I want them to remember that I was kind. I want them to remember that I brought them joy, or I brought them peace, that I was loving, that I was gentle, all of the fruits of the Spirit, right? The things that point back to God, that's what says that I am a godly woman, not the fact that my outfit was on point, or that I have a strong shoe game, or that I had on beautiful earrings, or I had on this really nice necklace, or my hair was all done up in this fancy style, right? Like, that's not the thing. If someone says like, hey, do you know Ree? I don't want to be like, yeah, the girl who always has on the big earrings, or the girl who wears the fancy dresses all the time, or, the girl who, has her face beat every time she comes out the house. That's not to say that these things in particular are horrible things or that you can't do these things, but that should not be the first thing that people bring to mind when they think of you. When they think of you, the first thing they should think of is your godly attributes. Like I said, the fruit of the Spirit: kind, patient, thoughtful, compassionate, loving, gives back to the community, right? These are the things that you want being said at first thought of your name being mentioned. And I think that was the point that Timothy was making. And that seems to be the point made in all of these other verses about modesty. Now, that being said, I do want to touch on a couple of different points about the concept of modesty and how it's traditionally been taught in the church. So first, I want to say that, like I said, modesty could be about your demeanor, it could be about your works, and it could be about what you're wearing, but it could also be about the cost. In 1 Timothy, it even talks about costly array. It mentions gold and pearls and things like that. Modesty is about living modestly, right? It's not just about your clothes, it's how do you act, how you carry yourself. But even when we bring in the concept of money, there's still a issue that we need to tackle of perception, of context, I guess. I learned this lesson when I moved to Boca Raton, Florida. There are some rich people in Boca Raton, Florida. I had never seen that level of wealth in my life. I don't think I've seen that level of wealth since. It is insane the amount of money these people have. And so, you'd be driving around. I was driving around in my little Honda back then. I think it was probably about 13 years old at that time. So I had like a 13-year-old Honda, and I would be driving around and everything in traffic with me was a Bugatti or a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, a Rolls Royce, just all the extremely expensive cars. We're not even talking about, us average people, rich brands like Lexus and BMW or Mercedes. We're not even talking about like luxury brands on that caliber. We're talking about straight up, you gotta be a millionaire to be able to afford this. That, or you are making very bad financial decisions in your life. But these people had a lot of money because they were living in multi-million dollar houses, driving, $500,000 cars or $250,000 cars. So they had money. They had tons of money. And that seems immodest for somebody like me. But is it though? Is it though? If everybody in the community is taken care of and they all got all this money, and you still got money that if somebody calls you and says that they need your help, you can still give them money too. Are you really, is that a problem? There is no number given in the Bible. And quite frankly, there couldn't be, because God doesn't change, but our worldly society does. And anybody who has lived through the pandemic knows that the cost of things is just skyrocketing. If you've done house searches before the pandemic and after the pandemic or during the pandemic, then you know that the cost of living is just outrageously increasing. And what you could buy before, you can't buy now, right? What $100,000 would have gotten you for a house when I first graduated from college versus today is outrageously different. Houses that I look at and I'm like, yeah, that's like $100,000, $200,000 house are now selling for like $400,000, $450,000. People are having to spend $500,000 for a townhouse, right? Like, there's no way, like, unless God just really wanted to show out and be like, okay, if you live during this time period, this is how much you're allowed to spend on clothing. This is how much you're allowed to spend on houses. This is how much you're allowed to spend on, food. If you live in this decade, he would have had to go in and tell us based on the inflation. Otherwise, there are certain things you would never be able to spend on because of how things have changed. But how much that costs and whether that is quote unquote costly is also relative to how much you have. So, for instance, I don't have kids. I am a single person who lives by myself without kids. There are expenses that I don't have that someone who does have kids has. On top of that, I work a job that pays a decent salary, which means that I may have more money at my disposal than someone else does. That doesn't mean that I should just go crazy and I should spend all of my money, But it does mean that from a percentage wise, I may be able to spend more money on, say, a car payment or a housing payment or a grocery bill than someone else may be able to spend, right? And then here we're just talking about things that we need. We need a car to get us to and from work. We need a roof over our head. We need to eat, things like that. But even from a leisure standpoint, I may be able to afford a trip to XYZ location that someone else may not be able to afford because they want to save for their kid's college fund, or they need to send their kid to soccer camp or something like that. And a lot of times we will look at each other and be like, oh, that's immodest, or that's costly, right? But things are very much dependent upon your situation. And so I think it's important when we talk about things that we remember that I think it's the heart of the matter, like understanding what the point was and the context and the heart of it. So for me personally, when I think about spending and modesty in terms of monetary, I try to make sure that I have enough money that if a family member calls me and says, I don't have any money and I need to buy my diabetes medication and it costs X dollars, can you loan me some money? That I can be like, yeah, I got you, right? If something happens and I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person and they need food or something like that, I can go get them some food. And it's not like, well, I can't help you because I can barely pay for my own self, right? I am at a position where I make enough money that I should be able to help those around me who need help when they need it. Now, I may not be able to pay, your $20,000 tuition, but I can help you with some lunch money. I can buy you a textbook, right? Like things like that, where my spending is not impacting my ability to help build God's kingdom or to support other people and my brothers and sisters in the kingdom. That is what I think it means to be monetarily modest. But like I said, study the verses, think about it. I just want to point out how this can apply dependent upon your income and where you are in the world. We didn't even get into where you are in the world, because let's be real. Our expectations and on quality of life and what we have and don't have in the United States is very different than how people are living in other parts of the world. And so if you were to compare my lifestyle and how much money I spend or what I buy and don't buy to somebody who grew up in a very poor country, I would look really immodest. Really immodest. But if you compare me to those people in Boca, I look really, really, really modest. So, which is it, right? That's the types of things that we need to think about when we're digging into this text. Now, another thing that I want to talk about before we get into attire, I want to end with attire, but there's been a lot of conversation around modesty and being a stumbling block or not being a stumbling block. And a lot of the conversation to women about being modest is very much surrounding not being a stumbling block to our fellow man. And while I agree that we should not be stumbling blocks, I think there are definitely a lot of situations where we know certain things, and we should avoid certain things. Like, for instance, I have family members that were alcoholics. I would not pull out a glass of wine in front of those family members, out of respect for them, struggling to maintain sobriety, and two, not to tempt them away from being sober, right? Like, I think that that's a stumbling block. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's wrong to have a glass of wine, but perhaps you should not be having a glass of wine in front of that particular person. The same thing is true with modesty. I think that just like I talked about with money, depending on what culture you go to, there are certain definitions of modesty that are going to change. As I said, I grew up in the United States. I could go out in, a knee-length skirt and, this hoodie, and I would be considered dressed modestly. If I got teleported into Saudi Arabia, they would probably stone me for showing my calves, right? Like, that culture would not consider that modest. My whole point is that I do think that to a certain extent, we each have our responsibilities of being respectful, that we're not, purposefully agitating people. If you're dating somebody in particular and you know that they get turned on by a particular body part and y'all are trying to wait until marriage and all of those things, it's probably in your best interest not to just be flaunting that body part in front of that person's face, right? Those types of things, I think, make perfect sense. However, there are also a lot of verses that talk about our own responsibility with dealing with temptation and lust and self-control. Self-control being one of the fruits of the Spirit. So if you are struggling with self-control, that is a you problem. That is a lack of connection with the Holy Spirit that we need to be praying about and trying to work on. Another verse that I found that I thought was particularly interesting is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. This is the verse where it says, most people quote this as God will not give you more than you can handle. It's not quite what it says, but it does say that when temptation comes your way, there will always be a way out, a way to escape, that he will not give you temptation that you just cannot get away from, that you have to give in. There's always a way out. And if that is the case, then it is always still your fault if you fall into temptation because somebody was wearing something that you found immodest, right? And I know I'm preaching to the choir because y'all are the ladies, but I'm just saying that if you grew up in a purity culture where they told you that your value was based on, what you wear and how you keep yourself, and that if the men are lusting, that is your fault. It is not your fault. They have a choice. It says that God is not going to give them anything that they can't escape. So if they still are lusting after you, that is a them problem. They chose that. Okay? Don't let that get in your head. Now, that's on them. That being said, the thing that I want to close out with, and I know, like I told you guys up front, be a little bit of a long episode, but the thing that I want to close out with is talking about the actual clothing part of modesty. Now, one thing that I find particularly glaring in the Bible is that if you study the Old Testament, God is a very detailed God, okay? If you go into the very beginning, back in Genesis 1 and 2, he tells Adam and Eve exactly what they can eat. He didn't just say, oh, you can eat stuff or go eat. He starts talking about the fruit that has seed, that produces fruit after its kind. Then as you keep going into, deeper into Genesis and deeper into the first 5 books, we get definitions about the feast days. We get told when. We get told what month. We get told how they should celebrate it, when they should not be working, what types of offerings. He doesn't just say go give an offering. Like, he specifies that it must be a bull or it must be a lamb. And in a lot of cases, he'll specify how old the lamb has to be. And like it has to be without blemish. You can't break the legs and like all of these things. There are so many details about these things. And, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg. They're just details. There's detailed about clothing and how you plant the food in your garden. Just details. But there is no verse in the Bible whatsoever that talks about what modesty actually means, right? So a couple of minutes ago, I was talking about how modesty means different things to different people. If you go to different cultures, they're going to say different things. They're going to feel a little differently about, maybe the length that you wear or the colors that you wear, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing with monetary modesty. But the Bible tells us that God doesn't change. So if God actually had a standard where he thought that this particular clothing was immodest, why did he say so? Why didn't he say, okay, Moses, write down, this is improper attire for women. This is improper attire for men. This is how much you should spend or this, et cetera, et cetera. There is no verses about that. We don't get a whole lot of discussion about what people have on or what they're wearing or why they have it on or how long it is or how tight it is or anything. He doesn't tell us that. It seems like he doesn't care. And that's interesting because I don't think he does. If you go back to Genesis 2, Adam and Eve were in the garden. Everything was perfect. And it tells us that they were naked and they were not ashamed. And it's very important to latch into this because it's such a random statement. If you're not really paying attention, you're just like, okay, they were naked, they were not ashamed, blah, blah, blah. And I guess for some people that's easy to skip over. That's always stood out to me. It's like, whoa, it's kind of bold. Like, it's a kind of bold statement. It comes kind of out of nowhere. Like, why do we need to know that they were naked and not ashamed? Why is that such an important thing to point out? Well, it's important to point out because they were living in perfection and they were not ashamed of their nakedness. But when we get into Genesis 3, the very first thing they notice is that they are naked and they become ashamed. See, nakedness, shame, and sin all entered our minds at the same time. They're linked. Nakedness, shame, sin. They go together. If you keep going in Genesis 3, you'll see that Adam and Eve decide for themselves to make clothes. They try to make themselves clothes out of fig leaves, which again, we're not told what those look like. And when God comes upon them and they meet with him, God then gives them animal skins to be proper clothing. Now, it never actually says that God mandated that they wear clothes or that God started telling them what was appropriate and inappropriate clothes. The entirety of the motivation of them wearing clothes was because of their own shame, their own guilt. They are covering themselves to hide their sin, to hide their guilt, to hide their shame. That is why we are wearing clothes. It has to do with our shame. I wear clothes to cover my shame. And in that, I want you to stop and think about what you find to be distasteful, what you find to be immodest. And I want you to also think about what parts of your body are you insecure about? Is there any overlap? Because I can tell you the things that I feel comfortable wearing show parts of my body that I feel unashamed of. And the things that I would look at and be like, oh, I feel like that's a little immodest for me, I wouldn't wear that, are things that would show parts of my body that I am ashamed of. Is that true for you? Just asking. Things to think about when you start going into studying things. Because there are no verses where God actually sits down and starts talking about this is, the length that you should be wearing. This is the tightness. All of that is societal. It's all stuff that we came up with, and that may vary from culture to culture and from person to person. But there is no hardcore, absolute guideline given in the text. And one last thing before we conclude that I want to point out is back to this idea of being a stumbling block. I've heard a lot of people, when they start talking about modesty, they'll be like, oh, there are certain things only your husband should see or only your wife should see, right? You need to save that for that person. And while I would agree with that from a fundamental level, I want to point out that when Adam and Eve find out that they're naked and become ashamed and go hide and clothe themselves, they were the only people on the planet. They were husband and wife. This is like you and your spouse are in your bedroom naked and you are ashamed of your naked. You're like, I have to put on clothes. That's not about marriage and covering yourself just for your spouse. That is an individual thing. That has to do with you. That has to do with the individual. Because, I mean, from our definitions today, you would say there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with them being naked with each other. I mean, husband and wife are supposed to be naked at least at some point. But the implication here is that they were ashamed even in front of each other to be naked. Now, granted, we know that God was calling them and they were ashamed to approach God naked as well. But I just want you to think about the whole of this message and the whole of what the Bible is saying about modesty, about clothing. And then when you have time, I want you to look up definitions, because the word that is actually used here that says modest, and when you look it up in the dictionary and get down into the definition, it still isn't, like, a lot of the things people associate with it are not there. So do your own due diligence, study, and pray. Of course, that is the most important thing. Pray about it and do the best that you can. Until the next time, have a great day. Bye.